2, 1.
Hi, virtually. My name is Cathleen and it's great to be with you guys. Thanks for joining this live stream. Luckily, nothing important happened in politics today, so I'm sure you weren't busy watching anything or doing anything. My name is Cathleen and I'm lucky enough to be a member of Another Europe is Possible and sitting on their national executive. And I'm also on the Open Labour national executive. I was asked by Another Europe is Possible to chair this debate today and chair this discussion into this fantastic report, which you can find on the Another Europe is Possible website. So just to give a little introduction, we've got two fantastic people here, one of which has written this report and has done all the work, and then one of which is a fantastic parliamentarian who's doing a lot of the work behind the scenes to fight Brexit and to obviously to fight what will be some terrible environmental consequences of Brexit and to put forward the best possible solutions for what is a terrible Tory dilemma. So just to introduce Open Labour, just to start by doing that. So I sit on the National Executive Committee of Open Labour. We are the kind of known as the soft left wing, made of activists campaigning for a Labour government, but also some transformative left-wing policies. And Another Europe is Possible was originally started a few years ago to campaign against a Tory Brexit, and now is one of those fantastic campaigns holding the government's feet to the fire and really doing some fantastic work. You can find David's report, which we're going to be talking about today. You can find it on the Another Europe is Possible website, and you can also find it on social media. I'm sure there'll be a tweet that you've linked on to find this live stream. Please make sure you give us a like. Please make sure you follow Another Europe is Possible and Open Labour. We'd love to hear what you have to say, and we're really excited to be doing this. So first, I think I have to introduce the main man, the guy who wrote this report, who's done all the hard work going into this. And it's a delight to be able to kind of share his work. So, I mean, I could talk a little bit about what David's done, but he's with us now, so I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. Oh, I think your audio's gone.
Hi there, and thanks very much for that introduction. And can you hear me okay? Yeah. It was a real pleasure to write the report, and thanks very much for asking me onto this event tonight. I'm actually sitting in a hotel room in Brussels, so sorry about the kind of slightly weird situation, but I hope the internet works out. When the UK was a member of the EU, it was a very active country on the environment. A leader, certainly up with the sort of leaders of the pack in some areas like climate, less so on other things, and in fact actively blocked a few things like the soil law. And as members of the EU, everything the UK did was subject to review from time to time by the Commission. And sometimes if the Treasury didn't want to spend the money on something in particular, the question would come up, well, are we going to be taken to the European Court if we don't do anything, if we don't comply? And sometimes that was totally critical in some decisions, like, big Thames sewer system, for example, which costs a lot of money and hugely increased water quality, which we've been talking about a lot in the last couple of years. I don't think that would have gone through without the threat of commissioning. So when we were talking in the referendum in 2016 about the possible consequences of the environment of the UK leaving Brexit, a lot of us thought, well, there's two dangers here. One, the UK will slip backwards, will get less ambitious, and we could even fall into a kind of right-wing government which wanted to follow through the Singapore-on-Thames deregulatory model. That was challenge number one. Challenge number two was that what would replace the Commission in holding the government's feet to the fire? Would there be any external pressure, not least on the Treasury? Okay, so what's happened since, briefly, is to start with, very important to know that since Brexit happened, all four countries in the UK, the four nations, have had much more ability to do their own thing. Devolution had happened already, obviously, but because so many powers on environment were held at the European level, the actual scope to exercise those powers, like in Scotland, which we might want to come back to, were quite difficult to fully exercise because there was so much power at the EU level, and the UK representation came through London and Westminster. So actually the devolved authorities often didn't feel they had quite enough of a place at the tables. So that's changed. That's number one thing. The second thing is, to start with, the UK, the Westminster government largely brought all the law across through the Withdrawal Act from Brussels, but then it started chipping away. And to start with, that wasn't massively visible. And some of the new things we put into practice in the UK, for example, emissions trading scheme, are very closely aligned with what happens in the EU. It's a very similar scheme, even though it's a UK one. What we started to see was a little bit more reluctance to necessarily follow what was going on in the EU, and more talk about deregulation in the UK. And that's happened bit by bit. I think one of the perhaps the strongest example of where the UK has gone off in a totally different direction is on chemicals policy. And I think people may have read in the press about a potential big increase in the number of chemicals falling foul of the EU regulatory system, which is called REACH. UK set up its own totally alternative chemical regulation system, but without the money and the competence and the staff to do the whole shebang that's been done in the European Chemicals Agency in Helsinki. We've been restricting far fewer chemicals, and we're increasing the costs on the UK chemical industry for having to register potentially both in the UK and in Brussels. So a lot of people in the industry think this is totally crazy, and certainly people on the environment side don't see it as the same level of protection. So that's quite a big issue. Then we've started to see more government criticism of regulations around environmental impact assessment. I think there are 4 bills in Parliament, all of which provide ministers with the power to change environmental impact assessment. The government's also quite sceptical about the habitats regulations, which are totally critical part of the protection of nature and wildlife. And again, there's 2 or 3 routes through Parliament at the moment for potentially changing those regulations, including actually a power in the Environment Act. So far, the gap between the UK and Europe is not got bigger. It's not that large, but we're starting to see measures where it could potentially get bigger, and we're starting to see places where, as the EU moves forward, the UK just isn't moving forward at the same pace. I mean, chemicals is one area, biodiversity is another area. We're also seeing Scotland which is trying to more or less keep pace with the EU legislation. In some cases, like with single-use plastics, for example, wanting to go faster than England, and therefore there being tension around the Internal Market Act and their ability to do that. So this wouldn't be quite so bad if it wasn't for the retained EU law bill. This has obviously made everybody in the environment community, and of course in the trades union community and others too, extremely worried because of first of all, the large powers given to ministers, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, to actually alter any measure pretty much at will or through statutory instruments which get minimal parliamentary scrutiny. But also inside this bill, there's provisions which basically say, if you're going to keep EU law for the environment, which is the great majority of law on the environment in the UK is based on EU law. So it's in that 4,000 plus measures of retained EU law bill on the dashboard, which has been put up by the Cabinet Office. If you want to change that, you don't want to do away with it. I think probably most of it won't be done away with. But if you want to amend it, you've got to follow some extremely strict guidelines about no administrative burden and quite astonishingly no impact on profit in companies involved. I don't know how one could possibly do an impact assessment would establish that. So there's an attempt to kind of put a real regulatory damper on the progression of environment law. So even if you could make it sort of better in terms of UK process, which is obviously possible in some cases, or more ambitious, which is great, we've suddenly now got a kind of big break just because it comes from the EU. It's inherently suspicious. So I don't want to underplay the ambition in Scotland, the complicated situation in Northern Ireland, where there's a mixture of EU-based law and domestic law, and some very interesting stuff going on in Wales, which is the most advanced part of the UK for recycling law, etc. So I don't want to contaminate the whole sort of 4 countries with too much focus on England, but there's a worrying, a big source of concern for us.
Brilliant. So for those who don't know, and I'm sure if you'll read the report, you'll know that David is an expert on this subject. And unlike Michael Gove, we are on the left here and we actually love experts and we want to hear as much from the experts as possible. David has been doing this for several decades, and I think he has a truly fantastic knowledge of how the European system works and how the UK system works. I think one of the things you said about in your answer there was, I think there's a lot of understanding of, we'll just copy and paste all the laws from the EU and we'll put them into the UK and we'll pass them. And that really is taking back control. And I think you kind of referred to that in your answer there, which I obviously think is absolutely fascinating. So I guess really, you kind of mentioned the environmental agency, you mentioned the nations and the regions, and then you mentioned a bill currently going through Parliament. But just to quickly summarise, just for those of us who aren't the experts like me, I'm very, very happy to admit I'm very far away from being an expert. What is the European Environmental Agency?
Right. The European Environment Agency is an organisation which is basically has lots of countries which are not in the EU in it, as well as all EU countries. And it's a place where information is shared, and basically the state of the environment in every country is tracked and recorded. Countries share their data so we can get a coherent picture of what's going on, which is very important in some areas like climate change, where what individual countries do is not really enough. And you're able to then capture real trends in Europe, and they do quite a bit of analysis to show, well, what we need to do next. And so they're not a kind of fierce, scary governing body. That's much more of an information exchange. But even so, the more dogmatic members of the government thought they'd get out of the European Environment Agency. It does cost a bit of money, I think 3 or 4 million euros possibly to be a full member. So it's not a zero cost, but in the scheme of things, it's not a big cost. And because we've dropped out of it, you now get these maps. So everybody in Europe's contributing their data, and then there's a grey patch for the UK because we don't want to play, and it does feel like a slap in the face. Not only do we not want to be in the EU, but actually, we don't really want to come to the party to share, even though there's no regulatory element inside that agency. So a lot of people on the environment side would like to, there's a kind of shared goodwill, and it'd be great if Labour government did this. Just let's rejoin or it needs to be associate member, you don't have to pay. There's an opportunity to demonstrate we haven't just gone off completely offshore and disappeared.
And on that note, I think that's a perfect time to introduce Alex Sobel, who's the MP for Leeds Northwest, and a fantastic Soblel MP that is really leading the charge on the environment. Unfortunately, right now, he's only a shadow minister in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, but hopefully when we watch this back in a year and a half time or 2 years time, he will be a minister, and what a fantastic day that of course will be. So Alex, just kind of hearing what David has said there, what are your thoughts on whether we should be in the European Environmental Agency, and is it really worth our time?
To be honest, it's not something I've really thought about, which is a really bad thing to say, and I'm not sure it's my decision to make, certainly not my decision to make alone. We did withdraw from quite a number of European agencies and initiatives where other countries who have associate agreements with the EU, like Switzerland or Norway, are still a member of. And so I think that those would be looked at by the UK on a case-by-case basis. And what I'm not sure is if we've diverged quite significantly by the time Labour's in government, whether we would still be able to join. That's probably a technical question for David rather than one for me to think about right now. But I think that we need to think about the future of the UK and the fact that our entire regulatory system is based on that 40 years of EU law, derived EU law, and actually what David didn't say, maybe because he didn't go into the parliamentary sort of process, is that all of those laws, over 4,000 EU laws, which completely take our regulatory framework, not just for the environment, the biggest set are from the environment, but there are many other areas as well, including, and I'm sure another responsible members would be interested in this, workers' rights. There's a huge number of workers' rights that are also derived from EU law, that they're sunsetted, which means that if they're not being considered, there hasn't been a copy and paste process, there hasn't been any sort of process. In December 2023, they will fall unless the government comes in and well, it doesn't have to take them individually one by one, but lists them and then gives them a further sunset date of 2026, which obviously, hopefully, will mean that they will get dealt with by that stage by a Labour government. So it will be very different. But my main concern this year, 2023, we haven't even passed the bill yet. So the civil servants can't even start working. Well, they can think about it, but they can't go through the process of retaining these laws or not. We won't get this through before Easter. We might not get this through before May. We might not. There is a possibility this will have to go into the next session because we're expecting King's speech in May. So this might be a complete and utter mess, this whole thing, with, particularly in DEFRA, and we're talking about environment now. So these are DEFRA laws where, these civil servants will have 6 months, less than 6 months, to do one of basically three things with each individual law, of which DEFRA has about 2,000. They'll either have to do what David said, copy and paste them. They'll either have to uprate them, and they also, the ministers and all the way through have said they can't downrate them, even though we put amendments in to guarantee that, which weren't accepted. So that makes me very concerned, very suspicious they'll try and downrate environmental law. So, or it'll get sunsetted, or the sunset will go to a later sunset, but either way. And then they could just disappear. And that means, so for instance, on waste dumping, there's lots of different regulations of waste dumping. Say they just didn't have time and somebody went and dumped some waste, there's no law. So they can be taken to court. That's what we're talking about. That's the real life effect. These are not theoretical things. These are a huge number of things on so many areas. We could go through that, we haven't got time. But that really protect people's lives, livelihoods, and our environment.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we speak about often when talking about the environment is one of those kind of big catch-all terms, but really it is everything from your litter on your street all the way up to the climate emergency and beyond. So I guess I'm going to ask the same question, but for the two fantastic panelists who have expertise in different areas. Say, a great thing happens, Labour is lucky enough, or we work hard enough to win the next general election, and we are in a position where we have a majority where we are able to do what we want. What would you like to see out of that? Obviously, a huge problem there with the sunsetting. In that first year of government, what can we realistically achieve to make sure that we are fighting the climate emergency and making the UK environment, both within the UK and around the world, the best it can be? So I'm going to go to David first, just because we've just spoken to Alex, and I think David will have a really good academic perspective on this.
Well, thanks a lot for that question. The first thing I'd like to see, ideally, is the abolition of the retained EU law bill. I mean, the whole thing adds nothing but hazard, not only to the environment, but other retained EU law. There's nothing wrong with re-examining law and trying to improve it over time in the UK, but having a ridiculous deadline, a ridiculous process, was also tying up civil servants' time. And if they screw up, they accidentally, and laws deleted by mistake, which is quite possible going to happen, there's no mechanism to bring it back again. So it's kind of just creates massive problems and really creates zero benefit. So I'd love to see a clean line from Labour saying, we just don't need this. It doesn't mean, we're going to keep every single EU law or anything, or we're not going to amend it. We just get rid of this whole stupid process, which also just annoys and makes life harder for the devolves. Another thing I think would be great if Labour did was sort of take off the negative threats to environmental impact assessment, to the nature regulations, so that you haven't got the whole environment community on constant edge, that something, the critical bits are being undermined. And then to put a little bit more teeth into some of the future targets. We've got new targets. Some of them I don't think are tight enough, and some of them need money behind them. So I know that's a hard thing to ask, but actually a bit of a commitment that we're going to fund the net zero targets, and so there's a real belief in the country we're going to do that. And Ed Miliband has been making some really good speeches around this, so I fully acknowledge that. But I think more generally on environment, we need to hear that, and having a rapprochement with the EU would really help. And if we said we will work in England with Scotland to a joint feeling about how we sort of keep up with EU law, if we really don't want to, what the process is, of why we don't want to, and then to avoid having this quite unnecessary, unhelpful tension between London and Edinburgh about the way that environmental law is progressing. I think there's tremendous quick wins for Labour, which would, win a lot of friends. And then just to reassure you, Alex, about the European Environment Agency, we could go back as an associate. It doesn't make any difference what's happened since Brexit. There's no barriers. I don't think it would cost too much. And it would be a great gesture that the UK was willing to talk.
I think that's a really interesting point you've made there. And just to pass on to Alex, I mean, hopefully you'll be entering government. Unfortunately, it's going to be omni-shambles. God knows even where you'll start, to be honest. Even just to speak about the environment, there's so many things to speak about. But I do know that the Shadow DEFRA team does punch well above its weight. So I'm sure, hopefully, when you get into government, if we're lucky enough, that is, that you will continue to do that, and the team will continue to do that. What does success look like for you and for the DEFRA team in the first year of a hopeful Labour government?
Well, just on this, so our policy is to repeal the retained EU law bill. So it'll be like one of those Marvel films where time goes back and then it goes forward again into the multiverse, and so you come to this alternative reality where we're sort of back with the EU laws that we had, the retained EU laws we had, and we have all of that. We have all of those EU laws and regulations. What will be interesting, and again, I'm not a lawyer, is if we do that and there's been a period of, wild, so some EU laws have gone, and people in that period, for instance, dumped some toxic waste somewhere and there was no regulation for it, would we be able to prosecute them because they did it in the period when there's no regulation? So that's something that we'll have to test. And obviously, that's something that we can legislate for, because what we don't want is people getting away with things like that because the Tory government did it. Although if they were stupid enough to do something like that, the Tories, I'm sure it wouldn't help them electorally wherever that waste was dumped. But what Labour is committed to is a Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So in those areas, we will see a much tougher level of regulation. For instance, on air quality, we will significantly increase the level of air quality regs, and that will mean, we're having this big argument at the moment about ULEZ and what Sadiq's doing, but actually to achieve the air quality ambitions that we have, it's carrot and stick, but we'll see a lot more clean air zones around the country and utilisation of that sort of regulation. On clean water, we have the sewage dumping scandal. Labour's committed to ending that and making the water companies pay for that. The water companies, amazingly, have managed to rack up £72 billion of debt, but also amazingly managed to pay their shareholders £72 billion in dividends. I don't know how they got the money for that, but clearly there's something there, isn't there? So they've basically blown all our money on dividends rather than fixing the system. So we're gonna ensure that happens. So there's a whole range of other areas. You know, nature's my main part of my brief, and the government have got an environmental improvement plan. The environmental improvement plan the government got is not terrible. I'm not gonna say, oh well, it's awful and we're gonna scrap it and start again. But there's two issues. One, they're not going to deliver their environmental improvement plan. Like just on the tree target, and yesterday was International Forest Day, and I put some stuff out about it. They are way off track. The National Trust put some stats out. Some other organisations, CONFA, which is the sort of timber industry association, have put some stats out, and they are nowhere near the level of tree plant they need to. One of the issues in the UK around this is land use and how we use our land and how that land is considered in a whole range of terms, including planning terms. So one of the things, and it's never happened in the UK before, we're looking at bringing in a land use framework, which is really important because there's always competing demands for land. So if you think about a piece of land that's not been built on, so what can you do with that land, and what can you do in planning terms? You could farm on the land. You could build houses or other types of property, commercial property on the land. You could renature the land. You could put trees on it, or you could maybe put if it's an area where there's been peat, you could create a peat bog. There's a whole range of different uses for land, but we're terrible in this country, and we haven't worked out how to really create a strategic way of delivering what we need in all the senses, whether it's housing, whether it's commercial property, whether it's infrastructure, or whether it's nature, or whether it's for food security. And that's what we're intending to do, and the DEFRA team starting that process. It's a whole range of things that we're trying to get done.
Well, I mean, there you go, you've heard it. The to-do list is incredibly long. Hopefully you'll be able to be there this time next year or the year after and crack on through that to-do list. Obviously, I mean, 13 years of a Conservative government and the planning regulation is terrible. We've lost our rights to speak about the environment. We want leading the way, and that's completely reversed. I have to say, it's truly sad to hear. And you mentioned Sadiq Khan there. I think I read a statistic a few weeks ago that said, I think about 10,000 Londoners die every year of prematurely because of air quality. And that is something that just breaks my heart, because that's something that, the UK could really be leading on. And I know there hopefully will be a lot of young activists on this call who are passionate about climate change. And I think air quality is such an important building block in creating a better future. As we say, another Europe, another world is possible. So just to quickly go back to David, you have kind of mentioned the retained EU law. Could you just very briefly, for people who aren't as smart as you and haven't got the decades of experience that you have, could you just briefly explain what that is? And then Alex, I'm going to ask for your update as to how you think that's going. Oh, sorry, you're on mute there.
Sorry. It's not that I'm smart. I just spend my days looking at this weird stuff. The retained EU law comes about because most modern environmental legislation dates back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, when we started putting in much tougher clean air, clean water, and then the beginnings of climate policy. And it was UK, like other members of the EU, did this in a collective way in a European framework. And there were a lot of advantages to that, and some disadvantages too. So by the time we got to Brexit, most EU law, most environment law in the UK is all based on EU law. Some it applies directly, some it's European directives which the UK interprets and puts it into law in its own way, in its own circumstances, and it's then overseen by the Environment Agency or some other agency. So there's been this big stack of law, and because at the time of Brexit, the danger was, for various legal reasons I won't go into, that a lot of this law would just fall away off a cliff. The government's decision in the Withdrawal Act was just to bring the whole thing across into UK law in 2018, and all that law brought across onto our statute book is called retained EU law. So there's a load of it, and so at the moment, the government's on this mission to get rid of it, basically, because they don't like the idea of retained EU law. It's not that they actually want to get rid of all the law. They can't really. There's far too much of it. But they don't want a block of it on the statute books. So they want to kind of domesticate that law. And a lot of it will become secondary legislation rather than primary legislation. And that is a really important point, because if it's primary law, like environmental impact assessment is in Scotland, if you change it, it has to have a proper parliamentary vote in both houses. If it's secondary legislation, it just comes out as a statutory instrument. It goes right through the system. A lot of MPs don't even know it's happening. You can't amend it. So this business of changing retained law into domestic law is quite a painful one. And by the government, by introducing this bill to try to, by a very, very short deadline, accelerate the review process to a ridiculous level, and then actually, as Alex was saying, things which don't get addressed at all can fall off the statute book and literally disappear off a cliff. And nobody knows how much of this law there is, to be honest. And some of it is very obscure, and it wouldn't be a problem if it disappeared. The laws on bullfighting, which don't apply in the UK, probably ancient fishery legislation, which is probably out of date. But there's all the substantial stuff's in there too. So it is absolutely critical that if we're reviewing this and messing about with it, we do it properly, thoroughly, in due course. And actually, we try to improve it, not just kind of tick the box, say it's now British. This is the chance, okay, let's make it better. As Alex was saying, we could do with better air quality legislation.
And then I kind of guess over to Alex. How do you really think this bill is going through the House at the minute?
I mean, it's in the Lords. So as we know, the Lords love to chop up bills and salami slice them. We haven't quite got to the stage where we know how the votes are going to go. But put it this way: all the amendments that we put down in Bill Committee, and I was on the Bill Committee, are being put down by peers in the Lords. And so it just depends how many get called to vote and how many have voted on. I mean, some of the big ticket items for us are around things like REACH, the chemicals regs, and the sunsetting. So we've asked, we've got amendments down which will automatically sunset some of them to 2026. There are things like creating the floor, so we can't reduce regulations. You can only uprate regulations, which obviously we're not gonna contest an uprating of a regulation. There's a whole range of really technical things. But I imagine that if we get those through, the Lords will go through this thing called ping pong, which means it goes between the Lords and the Commons, and it just depends where the timetable gets to. If they can't manage to resolve all of this in the Lords by the middle of May, which is when we expect the King's speech to be, then they'll either have to roll the bill over and start all over again in the next, or not start over again, but carry on the process in the next session, or they'll have to try and push it through. Now, the thing is, if they try and push it through quickly, that means that they can't really do ping pong because they haven't really got time. So what they'll have to do is they'll have to allow some of those amendments to stay, which will make the bill better from our point of view. So that would be great. So if we can get a lot of those things sunset to 2026, it makes our life a lot easier. But if not, if they are completely successful, we'll take that scenario, then actually what they've done in the bill, which we also tried to change, was they've got what's called a negative SI, which means, and this is very technical parliamentary stuff now, that when they bring the statutory instrument to change the law, you would have to what's called pray against it, so basically object to it, for it to go to committee, for us to be able to have a say on it. And that means, potentially we could either gum up the whole system with 4,000 of these, which is then they would decide that they want to have a slightly different approach, so they could just go, all right, fine, guys, we've had enough of this, we'll just sunset a load of them, which obviously would be a good result. Or we just see it go through the sunset. They would just go, we're just going to ignore all these, and we're just going to let them all drop. So, like, if it was like, for instance, the David on the bullfighting one, that's probably fine. But if it's like on chemicals regs, or on waste dumping, or on air quality, or on water quality, that's a disaster. So and that's what I've got a lot of sympathy for civil servants. They put the civil servants in an impossible position, the ministers, by not giving them any time to do this.
Brilliant. And I think you've heard a lot there from Alex about how the internal process works. It is worth pointing out that while May seems like a long time, there is, of course, parliamentary recess for the local elections, for the coronation and for Easter. So actually, when you think of the number of days in which the House is sitting, there's actually there's a very small amount of time and a rather large legislation to get through as well. Alex has been an MP since 2017 and has lived through the Brexit era. So I think he is all well adapt to talk about what actually happens and how a bill becomes a law. So I have been greedy enough and I have definitely taken up way too much time asking questions, but luckily I have some questions from the audience at home, one of which, just because we were speaking about water companies earlier, and obviously the work that the Labour Party has been doing and the opposition have been doing to highlight government failures in sewage. So I'm just going to quickly pop to that question, which a viewer has asked, which is, will the nationalisation of water companies, what about the nationalisation of water companies as an environmental protection measure? Would a Labour government be able to do that? Would a Labour government be interested in doing that? David, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, I obviously can't answer whether the Labour government's going to be interested in doing that, but I totally endorse what Alex said, that water companies have put not enough resource into actually following environmental law, and we've seen considerably increased pollution of sewers from sewers, for example, and money has been going into profits and financial engineering in a lot of water companies. So it would be certainly nationalisation would create some potential, particularly if the companies then in a nationalised form had the resources to invest properly. We are going to need to spend money on increasing increasing water treatments, getting rid of this overflow system on sewage works and so forth. So if there was the will to actually resource this properly and do this in a nationalised framework, I think we could see quite a big change, yes.
Brilliant. And just before I go to Alex, of course, I definitely will not ask him to say what Labour Party policy is 2 years out from the election, because that is completely ridiculous. But I do think that he should definitely highlight, if he has capacity, what changes can be made to water companies.
I mean, we do have policy as it stands, not on the ownership and the structure, but on the actual action. So our plan is that, and this would involve some change in the law. Like I said, we're going to have a Clean Water Act, which would involve automatic fines for water companies if they breached the regulation we're talking about today. There would be mandatory monitoring on every sewage overflow, which is where the biggest problems are now. There would be tough sanctions for water bosses, including criminal sanctions. So we could see people running the water companies going to prison. And our plan is that we would completely eradicate the systemic discharges by 2030, which aligns with some of our other goals around 2030, so like a net zero energy system. So, we're looking at a number of things. We're not talking about completely green economy by 2030, because that's a very short amount of time. But we've got a whole range of areas which we're intending to have very significant improvements or reach net zero on. And so with water, it's about those discharges being finished. There are other areas which affect water quality as well as sewage discharges, quite significant ones. But on that one, our goal is 2030.
Brilliant. I think those are really, really interesting answers. Definitely something to look at as the Labour Party continues to develop its policy. And of course, the work that Ed Miliband has been doing, the work the Shadow DEFRA team have been doing, and the work that Rachel Reeves has been doing into combating the climate emergency and making sure we have the best water quality is definitely something that I would read if you ever get a chance. And just to go for another audience question, the report talks about the UK lagging behind on the insulation and warming of homes. It's not just about aligning with the EU law when we left, it's about what they're doing now. So I'm going to go to David, because he has written this report and he is the expert of the chat. In this situation, David, what has the EU done kind of since we've left? What's it done to kind of improve insulation, and can we match that in the UK?
can you hear me? So am I on mute? Yes, this is a big gap, and I do talk about this in the report. Firstly, the way that the EU is progressing, it's trying to tighten regulatory standards around insulation, for example, in buildings, so that we try to make sure that our buildings are better built. And those of you who spent time in some continental countries will know how the windows fit in some countries, and they just don't in the UK. And we need to come up to that higher standard right across our built sector. And we just haven't got the regulatory system in place. We haven't got the aspirations. We haven't got targets for increasing energy efficiency. And what was very striking to me is during the whole Ukraine crisis, most European countries recognize, well, part of the answer to this is to actually reduce our gas consumption, use it more efficiently. We've got to do that anyway. We've got to meet net zero. Let's seize the chance to do it now. Look at the housing sector, look at the parts of the housing system where the poorest people live, with the least capacity to live with high energy prices, and really try to get an efficiency program in there. And the government was just extremely slow to even give the message of doing voluntary conservation. And we have not seen a real focus back on the energy conservation side of the equation, which is a completely critical part of the net zero approach. And in the EU, they've been talking about having an energy efficiency principle, of trying to say, okay, well, that's the way forward, a bit like the polluter pays principle. We should be trying to get the energy conserved as well as investing in more renewables, which is great. But there's two sides of that equation. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. And I hope we don't fall further behind. And I hope that's something on a Labour agenda, if there is a Labour government.
I think that answer is almost heartbreaking, because we were definitely, the Leave campaign definitely said so much about how we could lead the way and we could lead the charge to fight the climate crisis, or we could take back control of our laws and then make sure that we are leading in the charge for better insulation, for example. And, just from hearing your answer there, it actually seems like we've just fallen behind, and we've actually just, instead of, getting on with these key issues of the day, we've been worrying about things that are not actually going to help those people at home and the people listening to us on this chat. And that's really heartbreaking. Alex, a Labour government and insulation, a crisis, I guess, but how could you begin to solve a problem like insulation and warming homes?
This is part of Keir Starmer's national mission at conference last year. He said that ending the scandal that the UK has the least energy efficient housing in Europe is a national mission for Labour. And so, as people probably know, Labour's committed to £28 billion Green Prosperity Plan, 6 billion of which has already been allocated to creating the insulation scheme. And we're going to insulate upgrade insulation 19 million homes over 10 years. And so that's the number of houses who are under insulated. And in terms of new homes, we are going to massively increase energy efficiency rating. And, when we left office, we had the Code of Sustainable Homes, which is a ratcheting mechanism. And so by about, I think it's 2014 or 2015, if we'd been on that track and had been scrapped by the coalition, then houses would have been at that sort of passive house standard. But that was scrapped. And then the coalition came up with a plan to zero carbon homes. Then in 2015, David Cameron scrapped that as well. So actually, we've had the plans. We could have been on track, but it was always scrapped because of property developers and the construction industry's lobbying and involvement with the Conservative Party. And now, obviously, with Ukraine and gas prices and all of the rest of it, it's created a complete and utter national crisis, really. And the government have had to spend far more in subsidising people's energy bills, which effectively means that the energy companies can keep making the same profits. because the producers of energy are absolutely raking in, as we've seen people like BP and Shell and Ineos and others, instead of having spent that money over a number of years, and then we wouldn't have had this problem because people would have had well-insulated houses.
I completely agree. Isn't that just the saddest thing? One of the things to take from this conversation is that the water companies have not been regulated and have made an absurd amount of profit, and the energy companies have not been regulated and have made an absurd amount of profit. But David Cameron did hug that husky once, so I'm sure it all worked out for him. But obviously a big shame for the people of the UK, and it's obviously a shame as well. A terrible war in Ukraine that's completely illegal and wrong, but unfortunately, we're suffering at home because the government was unable to plan for an energy crisis, which I think is just devastating, really. So I'm well aware that I've only got these two lovely panelists for another 12 to 15 minutes. So I'm just going to squeeze out another question that has been sent to me from the YouTube channel. Make sure that you go on and follow Another Europe is Possible, follow David, follow Alex. They'd love to hear what you have to say, and we're always looking for great feedback. It's been a really interesting debate, and I'm excited to hear another couple of questions. So there's one here, which is about biodiversity. There's how much land in the UK is used for farming, and is farming fundamentally bad for biodiversity? So I guess, David, I'm going to go to you on that one. I think the environment is such a big topic that it's hard to break it down, but hopefully we've kind of got energy, we've got water, we've got insulation, and now we've got farming. So hopefully we've done a good bit of work there.
Interesting question. About 70% of the land in the UK is farmed. We have one of the largest proportions of farmland as the total land area in Europe, which is not that surprising because we've got a very large urban population, we've got a lot of people to feed, and we have a relatively small amount of forestry. I think it's around 12-13% of the land area is forest. And some of that farmland is so intensively farmed and on peat soils, which are degrading rapidly, that it is extremely bad for the environment. Some farmland at the other extreme is actually farmed in a way which is pretty sustainable. I mean, in a totally ideal world for biodiversity, you'd have a lot more natural habitat and a lot less farming, but we have to have a trade-off here. We need to eat, and we don't want to just import all our food and expect the rest of the world to feed us. So we've got to come up with a kind of a compromise which really, really works for the environment and for agriculture. And I think in practice that means that we have quite a long way to go to reduce environmental impacts. It's the major source of non-point water pollution, for example. That is a largely avoidable thing. It's a very important source of air pollution. A lot of that is avoidable as well. It's a significant source of ammonia emissions, which is particularly bad for biodiversity because it acidifies the soil. And of course, some management of habitats and hedgerows is very poor. So I would say, yes, we could do a lot to reduce the biodiversity impact of agriculture. And the RSPB has got a brilliant farm called Hope Farm, which just shows a pretty productive arable farm in Bedfordshire, where the biodiversity has actually been retained. There's a lot of birds, there's a lot of wild plants, which are not found in most arable parts of eastern England. And food production is pretty much the same, because it's being really managed with a lot of thought and care and support from science. So I think we've got to find that sweet spot where we get a lot of the polluting activity out of agriculture. We have a lot more positive management. Big wide hedges, for example, do help wildlife, and so that balance gets right. And I think there's a big discussion to be had. And if we have a Labour government, I think it's going to come onto your plate, Alex, about what's the future of livestock in the UK. How many animals is it really okay to have from a biodiversity point of view, from a greenhouse gas point of view, from a health point of view? So I think agriculture, having been a bit of an obscure area for a long time, actually is going to be much more in the political debates, and biodiversity is an important part of it.
I think you almost took my job there and introduced Alex for that question. So I guess farming in a new Labour government or the next fantastic Labour government. The question here is, you have so many people in farming that are so interested in progress. The NFU is a fantastic union with a huge amount of power, and all credit to them. But a future Labour government, what could you realistically do in farming and in agriculture, and will that harm biodiversity and what hopefully a Labour government will be trying to do in getting to net zero?
Well, I mean, David framed it really well. I mean, I just want to say I'm not responsible for farming. That's Daniel Zeitner, the MP for Cambridge. But obviously we're in the same team, and I'm responsible for nature and biodiversity. So those two things go together really well. And this is difficult already to say this, but we have moved on. I mean, I have to say one of the worst aspects of the EU was the Common Agricultural Policy. It did not help nature and biodiversity in terms of farming practice. And the UK and the Labour government, there was a minister, Michael Foster, who was MP for Hastings, who tried very hard to go to the EU and reform it, and then left government, and then his mission was to reform it outside government, and he didn't get very far. So the points they've made were all really valid. I mean, we've talked about this for a really long period of time. The thing that I said before about land use framework is really important, because we have lots of different types of farming land, and we have lots of different types of farming practice. And so we've got a number of tools in the box to improve farming practice. And we've got lots of exemplars, and David mentioned one of them. But those exemplars still add up to less than 1% of total farmed land in this country. So what we need is to utilise what's currently being rolled out, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is incentivising farmers to renature their land through public money. So it's public money for public goods is the concept, and it is a very good concept. It's being rolled out far too slowly, and it's not broad enough. So that's what a Labour government will do. And we'll also look at trying to move on farming practice and work with farmers to do that, and work in terms of technology, in terms of having more nature-friendly farming without significantly reducing yields, but improving both the quality of the land, because there are a whole range of issues with land, with nutrient depletion because of the way chemicals are used, and a whole range of issues, around water and water pollution. It's a really complex area where you really need a biochemist to explain it. But that's what we're going to try and do, and make less use of chemicals, more use of cover crops and other types of practice, including practices that have been there for thousands of years, like crop rotation, and also new types of crops as well. And in terms of livestock, yeah, absolutely. There is a food revolution. How we eat now isn't how we ate 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, for instance, you'd have no biomass fermentation. We're like, what's he talking about? What's biomass fermentation? I'm sure most people on this call have eaten some corn. That's biomass fermentation. So our eating habits have changed, and it'll change even more because of technology in the next 50 years. So we need to think about land use in that context, and how we might be able to make more food in a different way with less land, but involving farmers. And then we need to think about how we ensure those farmers and landowners have a livelihood. So it's really important that people live in rural communities have a livelihood, and that's the centrality of Labour policy in this area. But also, we are the most nature depleted country on the planet, partly because we were the first to industrialise, industrial revolution, and partly because of historical things around enclosures and all those sort of things, and the way we own and use land. So we need to try and bring all of those things together and bring nature back. I mean, hedgerows are a really good example. Hedgerows are part of a farmed environment. They separate out people, fields for different use or different land ownership. So, there already is a hedgerow strategy, but the government, again, are behind on delivering that. And so we need to up the number of people who can do that sort of work, up the support, up the funding, as well as all the other things. The things people first of all think about is tree planting. It's not all about tree planting. It's about a whole range of interventions and ensuring they're funded properly.
Fantastic. So I've only got a few minutes left. So I'm going to be really cheeky and I'm going to squeeze one last question, but I'm going to ask for a very brief answer from our two panelists. And this question is on how can the current British government, what can we do and what action can we take to make sure that the UK government does as much as they can between now and hopefully the next general election to cooperate with the EU to combat the climate emergency and to protect our environment? And I know, tough question, but I'm going to ask for really brief answers. And David, I'm going to head to you first.
Okay, so we're talking about the current Conservative government. What can they do? Well, first of all, I think we have to hold them to account and make sure this whole Retain EU law bill does not go in the way it could. And we have to be supporting the civil servants and helping them just avoid a big car crash. I think we have to get the government to, right now, as Daniel said, there's the environmental improvement plan. It's not all bad, but they have to get to show that they mean it. They've got a delivery behind it. We need to tighten up the support for the regulators like the Environment Agency, all of whom had their budgets totally cut and their effectiveness reduced. We could see that being reversed. We can help externally make that happen. I think there's chances on biodiversity, getting the new farming schemes better. That needs to be done in the next year. So as Alex says, tightening those up, making them more ambitious, getting them to operate on the ground. And I think drawing the attention of the government to the air quality problem and trying to increase the level of ambition and support the ULEZ extension, which is certainly a good example of something practical that can be achieved. Bit rushed.
No, perfect. Exactly what we wanted. Alex, I'm just going to ask for your final kind of comments on that, and then I'm going to unfortunately have to wrap up this live chat.
Absolutely. I think the big ticket items are we are party to a number of international treaties, including what we signed in Glasgow at COP26, which was our own presidency of COP. More recently in Montreal around nature, the biodiversity COP, but there was just recently a New Oceans Treaty signed. So the important thing is, in the short term, is the government is on course and delivering under its international commitments, because actually the EU, the UK, Canada, and a few other countries were leaders in getting those treaties signed and getting them at the level they were, not being diluted by other countries who enjoy diluting them, like the former Brazilian regime. So in the short term we can do that, and then the real thing that I've noticed, particularly around biodiversity, is we are not delivering what we signed up to internationally domestically, and so that's what we need to do. Because if we don't do it, then other people won't do it.
Yeah, I completely agree. And please, I know I've said this several times, but David's report is a really fantastic read. Please give it a look on the Another Europe is Possible website, download it and send it to a few of your friends, because I bet they'd want to read it too. I think if as much people know about what's going on as possible, then we are in the best case scenario and we can be as educated as we can. I would also say join Another Europe is Possible if you're not a member. They're always keen to get more members, and follow them on Twitter. They are absolutely fantastic. I of course have to say Open Labour is leading the charge on a lot of these things, and we can't do it without your help. I'd also very cheekily say that Leeds Northwest is only 2.5 hours on the train from London, and that Alex is always on the lookout for more people to come and canvass for him. Please don't take this for granted. A future Labour government or a future coalition is not something we can take for granted, and it's something we have to fight for every day. And hopefully I'll be doing that, and please support Alex and those fantastic politicians who are really, really putting in the hours to make a better future for all of us. I'd also like to say a quick thank you to Dr. Luke Cooper, who did a huge amount of work in actually the back end of all of this. He definitely was the maestro behind setting this all up, because there is no way I could have done it on my own. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to say, download the report and hopefully I will see you soon. But thank you to our two fantastic panelists. It's, we're completely right to say that the more experts, the better informed we are, and hopefully we can do this again. Brilliant. The awkward Zoom wave. Fantastic.